Good morning, grade 2s. Today we'll be moving on to a new unit on westward expansion, and you'll be looking at what people saw in the 1800s while they were traveling west on the Oregon Trail in the United States. You could have been going west in the 1800s. In those days, there were no cars. You would have traveled in a covered wagon like the one shown here. Your wagon would have been pulled by horses, mules, or oxen. You and your family would have bumped along unpaved dusty roads. You would have traveled all day long, and it would have taken you about 6 months to get from the east to the west. Does that sound like fun? Actually, your trip might have been even harder. Your family would have had to pack everything you own into a wagon, including personal belongings, clothing, food, water, and other supplies. So there wouldn't have been enough room for you to ride in the wagon. That's right. You might have had to walk all the way to Oregon. In the 1840s and 1850s, tens of thousands of Americans went west in wagon trains. These pioneers hoped to make a better life for themselves. Many of them were eager to claim farmland in Oregon or California. They left many of their families and friends behind, loaded everything they had into a wagon, and set off for the West. The following story is based on journals and diaries that people left behind. We will be talking about the Morgans. Morgans were farmers. They hoped to start a new life in Oregon, and this is their story. The Morgans left for Oregon in April of 1846. They had a single wagon loaded with all of their belongings. Mrs. Morgan and the young children rode in the wagon. The older children walked alongside. They also helped herd the cows that trailed along behind the wagon. On their first day of their journey, the Morgans traveled 14 miles. When the sun began to set, they set up camp. The boys gathered wood for a campfire. Then Mrs. Morgan cooked supper. After supper, Mrs. Morgan set up beds for the children in the wagon. Once the children fell asleep, she lit a candle and wrote the first entry in a journal she decided to keep. The diary wrote this: April 11th, 1846, began our journey to Oregon, made 14 miles on our first day. The sun felt warm upon our skin as we made our way along. Our journey was brightened by the wildflowers that dotted the landscape. By the time we made camp, the older children were exhausted from walking. I have to admit that I gave them each a little extra stew for supper tonight. For the next few weeks, the Morgans traveled west across Indiana and Illinois. As you can see on the map, it would have taken them 61 hours to get there. They rose early each morning and traveled until just before sundown. On their good days, they covered 20 miles. When it rained or the roads were bad, they covered fewer. About 1 month after starting their journey, the Morgans reached the Mississippi River. They hired a ferry to carry them, their wagon, and their animals across the river. On that day, Mrs. Morgan had a lot to write in her journal. This is some of what she wrote. May 10th, 1846. The great Mississippi is wider than I could ever have imagined. Our wagon, our horses, and our supplies were loaded onto a flatboat and carried across the mighty Mississippi. I held my breath as I watched all our earthly possessions float away. Another month later, the Morgans reached St. Joseph, Missouri, where they bought food and supplies. The next morning, they crossed the Missouri River. This meant they were leaving the United States and were entering the area people call the Indian Territory. On this day, Mrs. Morgan wrote in her journal, June 5th, 1846, the children are hoping to see Indians. We have told that the Cheyenne and Pawnee live in the area we are traveling through. We have heard that they are sometimes willing to trade horses and food for clothes and tobacco. A few days later, the Morgans turned onto the main road to Oregon known as the Oregon Trail. There were many other settlers traveling on this road. The Morgans joined with a group of more than 100 settlers traveling to Oregon. By mid-June, the wagon train was crossing the Great Plains. On all sides, they saw vast open fields of grass without a tree in sight. The Morgans also began to see large herds of buffalo. They noticed that these magnificent creatures spent much of their time with their heads bowed, grazing on the abundant grass. On one moonlit June night, as the stars sparkled in the sky, Mr. Morgan shot a buffalo and Mrs. Morgan cooked the meat for supper. On that night, Mrs. Morgan wrote in her journal, June 14th, 1846, buffalo meat, although tasty, takes a lot of chewing. I watched the children eat as the flames from the flickering fire lit their dirty faces. The good thing was that while they were still chewing, they weren't complaining. A few days later, the Morgans' wagon broke. Mrs. Morgan stood guard all night in the rain while Mr. Morgan fixed the wagon. 2 weeks later, something even worse happened. 8 of the oxen that pulled the Morgans' wagon vanished during the night. The Morgans searched for the animals but could not find them. They hitched up some of their cows instead, but these animals were not used to pulling a wagon, and the Morgans made slow progress until they could finally find better animals. How are you liking the story so far, grade 2s? We will continue with this story tomorrow. Please answer all the questions that you can find on Google Classroom. You can either have an interactive conversation with your parents or just think about the responses on your own. Have a great day!